Welcome to the Catholic History Show. Today, we're going to talk about Henry VIII and the Holy Maid of Kent. Hope you enjoy. Many of you probably know who Henry VIII is. He's that famous King of England, the second Tudor king, the guy who basically invents Anglicanism. However, it's possible that many of you have not heard of the Holy Maid of Kent, also known as Elizabeth Barton. So today's story is really about how those two lives are intertwined and how the life and death of Elizabeth Barton played a significant role in the execution of St. John Fisher and St. Thomas More. So, in order to really kick this story off, we need to go to a very specific date, and that is the 23rd of March, 1534. Because on the 23rd of March of that year, two things happened simultaneously, one in Rome and one in London. The first we'll talk about is the one in London, and that is when the House of Lords passed the Bill of Succession. Now, the Bill of Succession was really Henry's attempt to force the legitimacy of his new wife, Anne of Boleyn, and their subsequent daughter, Elizabeth. And within this Bill of Succession was a demand for an oath of succession, or also known as an oath of supremacy, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Now, the second event that took place on March 23rd, 1534, was a council of cardinals at the Vatican declared publicly that Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his first and legitimate wife, was in fact a legitimate marriage, therefore nullifying in the eyes of the church everything that the House of Lords had issued on that same day. Okay, so now let's talk about Elizabeth Barton. 1506. That's the year in which Elizabeth Barton is born in a small town called Aldington, which is about 15 miles west of Canterbury. And we don't know a whole lot about her early life. We know a couple of things, like she was educated, which was paid for not by her family, but from another family. But what we do know is that in 1525, she becomes sick. We don't know what the disease is, but we know that this sickness causes her to start going into trances. And during these trances, she starts having visions. Now, at this time, as in most times, when people start having visions or prophesying, that starts to draw a lot of public attention. And this case was no different. There would be people that would come all the way to Aldington just to witness this woman having these visions. Needless to say, the rector of the parish in Aldington becomes greatly concerned, specifically because they don't know whether or not these visions are of God or of a mental illness or are demonic. So he informs his bishop. Now, like I said, Aldington's about 15 miles west of Canterbury. So his bishop is actually the Archbishop of Canterbury, who at the time is His Excellency Bishop Warham. Now, Warham is the last real great Archbishop of Canterbury, Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury. After his death here in the next couple of years, they replace him with Archbishop Cranmer, who is a secret and then an out-and-out heretic. Which is obviously problematic. And it's Cranmer who decides the issue of Henry and Anne. Regardless, His Excellency Archbishop Warham was not like Cranmer. He was an awesome bishop. Very orthodox, very pious, and he would die that way. But in 1525, he exhorts Elizabeth Barton, the Holy Maid of Kent, to go to Our Lady and pray for deliverance from whatever malady was afflicting her. So she finds this small hermit chapel, and she goes in there and prays in front of a statue of Our Lady. And lo and behold, she has this miracle, and she's healed of her sickness. However, she continues to have visions. In 1525, there wasn't much talk about Henry VIII and Catherine's marriage. Everybody wanted Henry to have a son, of course, but no one was talking about him getting a divorce. However, as we approach 1528, now all of a sudden there's a lot more talk about what's Henry going to do about Catherine of Aragon. Now, it's important to remember that the English people, who are at this point Catholic, they are Catholic, There are some Protestants existing in hiding, basically, in some of the universities. However, the English people, by and large, are Catholic, and they love the Queen, Catherine of Aragon. Oh, and by the way, they also love her daughter, Mary. This is an important point to remember, because when we talk about the marriage between Henry VIII and Catherine, and Henry and Anne, a lot of times we forget to look at it from the perspective of the English people. Throughout Anne's reign as queen, the English people were not happy about this. It wasn't a revolution of the people. It was a revolution of the rich elite of England. And this is an important point to remember. Okay, so back to our story. 1528. Elizabeth Barton is having visions now about Henry VIII and his relationship with Catherine of Aragon, and his side relationship with Anne Boleyn. So in 1528, Elizabeth Barton approaches Cardinal Wolsey. Cardinal Wolsey is the Lord Chancellor for England, which basically means he's the right-hand man for Henry VIII. Up until this point, Cardinal Wolsey knows that Henry VIII is not pleased with his relationship with Catherine of Aragon because he doesn't have a son, and Cardinal Wolsey is working diligently in order to get that marriage annulled. Elizabeth Barton approaches him, and she talks to him about her visions, about Henry VIII's life is in jeopardy if he does not remain with his wife Catherine of Aragon, and that she is receiving these messages from our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and the Blessed Mother. Whether you believe in the prophecies of Elizabeth Barton or not, it's clear that on some level Cardinal Wolsey does, because after this point, after this meeting between him and Elizabeth Barton, he starts to have serious doubts about this annulment of Henry VIII. And we also can tell this because she asks Cardinal Wolsey for an appointment to meet with the king, to tell him about her visions. And Cardinal Wolsey grants this request. Now, she goes in front of Henry VIII and tells him that God is not pleased with his relationship with Anne Boleyn. One of the most tragic figures in English history is the figure of Anne Boleyn. There's not much you can say other than that she was just awful. Everything that she does is in order to become Queen of England. And the number of people she has to have killed or influences the death of is ridiculous. When Catherine of Aragon finally does die, Anne Boleyn goes around the court screaming about how indeed, finally, now she's queen. And she talks about how tragic it is that Catherine's daughter, Mary, didn't die with her. The woman was depraved. Regardless, Henry VIII, for whatever reason, fell in love with this depraved woman. And this isn't trying to take away responsibility from Henry VIII for what he did. Clearly he did. But this woman was maniacal. When Elizabeth Barton meets with Henry VIII and explains to him that God is not pleased with his decision to leave his wife and go after Anne Boleyn is also not happy. And she immediately begins trying to figure out how she can get this Holy Maid of Kent executed. So as the years continue to go by and Henry continues to try and get this annulment done with Catherine of Aragon, Elizabeth Barton, the Holy Maid of Kent, continues to live near Aldington, and she becomes an actual professed nun. Well, as the years go on, she continues to have these visions, and more people come to see her to actually get her guidance. Two of these people are St. John Fisher and St. Thomas More. Now, it's not clear whether St. Thomas More actually believed in the prophetic visions. We know for a fact that St. Thomas More was very skeptical of quite a few different apparitions or visionaries. So it's quite possible that he did not actually believe in the prophetic message. However, we do know that St. Thomas More agreed with Elizabeth Barton that Henry VIII needed to stay with his legitimate wife, Catherine of Aragon. However, St. John Fisher, on the other hand, the holy Bishop of Rochester, very devout man and a great scholar in Christendom, St. John Fisher did believe in the prophetic messages of Elizabeth Barton. In any event, a lot of people do actually believe in her, and a lot of the great people of the land at that time come and meet with her. Okay, so this brings us to 1534. At this point, the right-hand man of Henry VIII is no longer Wolsey. It's not St. Thomas More. It's a guy named Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell is one of those interesting characters in English history because he is a man of major influence and power, and yet he doesn't care about the issues that everybody at the time cares about, namely the issues of religion. Right? In England at this point, you have the Protestants, right? 1517 to 17 years ago. So Protestantism is all over Germany and it's spreading into England. And then you have the predominant number of people in England who are still Catholic and who despise Protestantism. Then you have Henry, who thinks he's the greatest Catholic who ever lived, and oh, yes, also the Pope. And then you have Anne Boleyn, who is trying to destroy everyone's life because she wants to be Queen of England. Cromwell doesn't care about virtually any of these issues. What Cromwell cares about is making as much money as he possibly can, and he is willing to do whatever it takes to get that. This brings us back to Elizabeth Barton. Remember at the beginning of this video I said March 23rd, 1534. It was Thomas Cromwell who pushed the Bill of Succession through the House of Lords. It was him who was instrumental in making sure that Henry was going to get this wife that he wanted, Anne, and get the annulment he wanted of Catherine of Aragon. However, he knows that the vast majority of the English people are still devoutly Catholic, and they're still in love with the true queen, Catherine of Aragon. So, he needs to make a public example of the people who are supporting Catherine of Aragon. And everybody knows there is the Holy Maid of Kent just down the road who has been spreading all of this stuff about how Catherine is Queen of England still. So he's going to make a public example of her, and he's going to make a public example of everyone else who is affiliated with her. The problem is, he doesn't know who is actually affiliated with her. So, he goes and gets the Archbishop of Canterbury, a guy named Thomas Cranmer. Thomas Cranmer had been educated at Cambridge and had been influenced by Protestants years and years before. However, he knew that becoming Protestant or publicly Protestant in Henry VIII's England was a bad mistake. This brings me to another important point. It's very important to remember that while we in history look at Henry VIII as the start of Anglicanism, a true Protestant, he never saw himself that way. He saw himself as a devout Roman Catholic. When he was born, he was the second son of Henry VII. And being the second son of Henry VII, he was going to be raised to be a priest. He was going to be in the clergy. His brother, his older brother Arthur, was going to be king. So throughout Henry VIII's life, he is educated in all the theological schools of England, and he is destined to become one of the great clergy. Then Arthur dies, so he has to become king. So Henry VIII knows quite a bit about theology, and he, throughout his life, has defended the Catholic faith. He despised Luther. So Cranmer and every other Protestant in England knows that you can't come out publicly as a Protestant in Henry VIII's England, because if you do, you're going to be burned at the stake. However, Cranmer also knows that by supporting Thomas Cromwell and Anne Boleyn, that he is going to make it easier for in the future, when the Protestants do want to come out, i.e. when Henry VIII is dead, it will be easier to do it under this false monarchy of Anne Boleyn and her daughter. So he's going to support whatever Cromwell and Anne Boleyn want. So Cromwell goes to Cranmer, and he's like, Cranmer, I need a list of names of all the people that have visited with Elizabeth Barton, and I need to know all the people that agree with her. So Cranmer goes and visits Elizabeth Barton, and he cajoles her, and he tells her about how important her work is, and how great and pious, and how she's an inspiration to bishops like him. And he just smooths her over. And then he asks, who are all these people that are agreeing with you? And poor Elizabeth Barton gives him a list of names. So he goes back to Cromwell and says, here's your list of names. Now Cromwell has a list of people that he can bring a bill of attainder against. Now, probably many of you don't know what a bill of attainder is. At this point in time, most people in England, you have to be judged by a jury of your peers. However, there is this caveat. I'm not going to get into the whole legal thing about it. It's very interesting, and Belloc writes multiple chapters about it. So if you're interested in it, you can read in his book on Wolsey or in his book on Cranmer. You can read all about it. In any event, a bill of attainder basically is a loophole in English law that allows the government to try and execute somebody without a jury of their peers. So Cromwell is using this bill of attainder to basically get all of these people on the list either executed or brandished as treasonous. Two of the names that appear on this list are, of course, St. John Fisher and St. Thomas More. Now, a lot of historians have it written that St. Thomas More at this point distanced themselves completely from the Holy Maid of Kent. This is not true. This is false. What actually happens is Cromwell specifically goes to the House of Lords and removes St. Thomas More's name from the list because he doesn't want to have him necessarily lumped in with this group. He's going to make a separate example of St. Thomas More. St. John Fisher, his name still appears on the list, and he has to pay £7,000. So, 23rd of March, 1534, the Bill of Succession now, that's the oath that all the English people have to take, saying that they swear allegiance to the fact that the king is the supreme leader of the church, comes out. Fast forward to the 20th and the 21st of April, and this is when Elizabeth Barton is executed by hanging for her treasonous activities. They hang her, and then they cut her head off, and then they boil her head so that they can put it on a spike outside the Tower of London, as a reminder to everyone else who is thinking that speaking out about Henry's divorce to Catherine is against God's will. Now, like I said, a couple months later, it doesn't matter for St. John Fisher and St. Thomas More because they're going to be martyred. They're going to be executed for refusing to take the oath of succession. But it's important to remember that Cromwell had them brandished treasonous because of their affiliation with the Holy Maid of Kent prior to their not wanting to make the oath of succession. Okay, so this is a story of Henry VIII and Elizabeth Barton, the Holy Maid of Kent. And I think it's a really important story, especially for our times, because she is an example of someone. She comes from the humblest of origins. She loved God. She was a pious woman. She spent most of her days in prayer, and she had the courage to stand up to Henry VIII of England when hardly anybody else in Christendom was standing up to him. The Pope himself, Clement VII, was doing everything he could to try and prevent a break between Rome and England. And here was this humble woman that was just begging the king, begging him to go back to his true wife, Catherine of Aragon. So it's a reminder to all of us that through humility, through prayer, we can have the courage to do great things. Now, she wasn't successful in stopping Henry VIII's divorce, but she was able to stand up when no one else was standing up. And I think that alone is a great achievement. So, hope you enjoyed this video. Until next time, God bless.